Hi, my name is FPaine, and today we're going to be looking at the different parts of a research study in a presentation that I've entitled, What Do I Do with this Hypothesis? The objectives that we're going to cover during this presentation are first to justify the need for institutional review boards from history. Next, we will describe the 3 types of reviews completed by the IRB. Then we will describe special populations that are protected by the IRB. Then we will describe how to choose a sample size, research protocol, different research instruments, and how to debrief after a research study. And finally, we will identify the rationale for using pilot studies. The first step after deciding on a research design is to obtain approval from the Institutional Review Board. You may wonder why this is an important step and must be obtained before any other part of the research design can be implemented. It is important to have an understanding of what caused the need for IRBs. The group that initially brought to light the need for human protection were the Nazi doctors that committed many atrocities to other human beings in the name of research. Some of these physicians would later stand trial for the research that they completed. And 10 principles were initially developed to protect human subjects, called the Nuremberg Code. The most important aspect of this code was the need for people to consent to the research trial in which they were participating. It is easy for us to take a holier-than-thou approach and say what awful things the Germans did during World War II, and it was truly awful. But until you look at the syphilis study that took place in the United States and you recognize the need for us to have IRBs as well. The result of this study was the Belmont Report. It was written that stated that human research participants should be treated with respect, beneficence, and justice. In 1974, the National Research Act established the modern IRB. In 1991, the Common Rule for Federal Policy for the Protection of Human Subjects was formally adopted to ensure the protection of human participants in research studies. It's important to understand the reason for the IRB and why it is such an important part of the research process. Like Maya Angelou said, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. The IRB's primary concern is the welfare of the human participants. The researcher must submit the research design in detail to the IRB to make a decision about the study. The researcher must describe how they will conduct their research and the participants that will be used. Then the IRB must make a decision about what the risks to the participants are and what the perceived benefits are of this study. The IRB must then decide whether or not to allow the study based on the risk to the participants. The decision of the IRB is final, and so a study that does not meet IRB approval will not be conducted. There are 3 types of reviews conducted by the IRB. The first is an exempt study. An exempt study is one in which there is no apparent risk, either physical, emotional, psychological, to the participant and does not require review by the IRB. An example would be comparing different educational strategies in a classroom setting on a group of college students. An expedited review is when minimal risk is perceived to participants. An example could be using some focus groups. Focus groups involve more people, and so there could be some kind of psychological aspect to the person participating in that study. A full review is implemented if there is perceived high risk or with any special population that is considered high risk. The researcher does not get to decide the review status, but is instead decided by the IRB. Example of a research study that might require a full review would be either a research study involving prisoners or some kind of drug study. If there's a medication study, this could be high risk for the participants involved. Special populations that are considered especially vulnerable must always have IRB approval. These special populations are people with cognitive impairment, children, and prisoners. The major ethical concern with those that are cognitively impaired is the ability to understand what they are agreeing to in a research study. It is imperative that researchers are aware if a person can consent to the research trial. Not everyone with a cognitive impairment is incapable of consenting to a research trial. If a person is unable to consent to the research trial, it is the duty of the researcher to find the individual legally responsible for the person to obtain consent from. Children are considered a vulnerable group in research. There are 4 categories concerning children in research in which the IRB will grant permission for the study. The 4 categories are: first, there is not more than minimal risk to the child. Second, there is greater than minimal risk, but potentially provides direct benefit to that child. Third, there is greater than minimal risk and potentially doesn't provide any benefit to that child, but can add knowledge about the child's disorder or condition. And fourth, the research is not usually approved, but presents an opportunity to understand, prevent, or alleviate a serious problem affecting the health or welfare of children. Once approval is gained by the IRB, consent is obtained from the child's legal guardian, but also the child must give assent. The child must be informed about the conditions of the trial, and they must also agree to participate in the trial. While it's not legal consent, it is important for that to be part of it. A full review is also sought for prisoners, because prisoners may feel that they are not in a position to decline being part of a study. In order for prisoners to be considered part of the study, there must be minimal risk to the prisoner, either physically or psychologically, if there is any risk at all. Once IRB approval is obtained, it is now time to select the sample and obtain consent from the participants. The researcher must decide the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the participants in the study. The researcher must come up with a strategy to recruit the participants that they need for this study. The researcher must decide how large a sample to obtain. The sample must be large enough to adequately prove the relationship between the independent and dependent variable, but should also be small enough to be cost-effective. Once an adequate number of participants are recruited, they must give their consent to be part of the research trial. This consent should include all aspects of the research study, should be easy to understand, and should provide enough information for the participant to decide if they would like to participate in the study. Another important aspect of the consent is that they need to be aware that they can withdraw at any time from the study. They also should be aware of what will be done with the data. It is important to specify all the details of the research plan that are to be carried out. The researcher must designate the specific sequence of events and the steps of data collection. This should all be done prior to the study actually being performed and should be strictly adhered to when it comes to time for the actual research study to be done. They must plan down to something so specific as to how the participants are greeted, the nonverbal communication of the researcher. Should they smile at the participant? Should they nod at the participant? All of these things can affect what actually happens during the research study, and is important for the researcher to line out, to be carried out throughout the study. All of these steps that must be thought of in advance. All of these things seem very tedious, very minuscule, but are important to actually produce the results that the researcher is looking for, either for the positive relationship or negative relationship between the independent and dependent variable. Research instruments are the method by which the independent variable is manipulated and the dependent variable is measured. How are we going to manipulate the independent variable? How are we going to measure the dependent variable? The researcher can be a very key part of this. They can manipulate the independent variable, and then they can also measure the dependent variable just by their observations. This would be the least scientific method of doing this, depending on the study. It could be an electronic device. The example given by Christensen et al. Is they can have something that shows up on a screen and then measure their pulse with an electronic device. It can even be more sophisticated devices, such as using an EEG to measure brain waves. Data collection should follow the research protocol very closely. How the researcher says that data should be collected is exactly how it should be collected. Should be through a type of study that has been verified, or a collection device that has been verified and validated. Debrief is the end point for research participants. We don't just have the participants come in, do the study, and then say, see ya. This part, the debrief part, gives the participant answers to questions of the research study. There's 3 functions. It's ethical, educational, and methodological. The research participant can be told if they were lied to or are deceived during the study. They can also be told what they're going to be using this for. And then they can look at the process of the research study. Did they follow the methods exactly? 2 methods are questionnaire or face-to-face. Questionnaire, you just hand them the questionnaire and it has all of the steps. Face-to-face is more interactive, and a lot can be gained from face-to-face. People will sometimes talk to you more and give their honest feedback in a face-to-face rather than filling out a piece of paper. Pilot studies. What's the purpose of a pilot study? It's the entire experiment on a small scale. It's important because it can indicate whether the manipulation of the independent variable produced the intended effect. First, it's more cost effective to use the smaller study. Second, we can find out if there's a problem in the actual design. This doesn't work this way. This will actually work better if we do it this way. And that way we've done it without the cost of the entire sample size. We can use that much smaller sample size to see how the effects go. It's still going to be important to get consent for a pilot study. It's still important to debrief after the pilot study. This smaller study gives us the option of not doing such a large-scale study to find out that the study didn't work the way that we thought it should. In conclusion, after deciding on the design, the researcher must obtain IRB approval. We want to ensure that the sample size is small enough to be cost-effective, but large enough to prove a relationship. It is imperative to ensure strict adherence to the research plan. A pilot study is an effective way to test a theory with less cost to ensure the value of the study. Here are the references. Thank you so much for paying attention to this research presentation.